The Lend-Lease policy was a program under which the US provided Allied powers with military equipment and strategic resources. Officially, President Roosevelt signed the Lend-Lease bill into law on March 11, 1941. But in reality, things were slightly more complicated, especially with aircraft. Years before the start of the war in Europe, the US had already begun supplying friendly nations with American planes. For example, during the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Air Force of the Republic of China purchased more than 100 Curtiss Hawk III biplanes, and later bought a batch of Martin 139WC bombers as well. Despite considerable difficulties, the Chinese also succeeded in setting up the production of the American Vultee V-11 attack aircraft and the Curtiss P-36 monoplane fighters. It wasn't until the spring of 1939, though, that foreign clients started buying American aircraft in large numbers. That was the time when it became evident for European policymakers that the war with Germany was unavoidable, and they made an effort to bolster their military capabilities by purchasing American aircraft, like, for instance, the Lockheed Electra airliner, or, more specifically, its military conversion known as the Hudson. When the war went into full swing, the US technically remained neutral, but never stopped supplying their clients with aircraft. They simply found a roundabout way to do it. For example, Americans started leaving the planes on the Canadian border, where they kept being stolen by subjects of the British Crown, and later transported to the UK. Every time German diplomats tried to raise a fuss, Americans simply said that they did their best to stop those dastardly thieves, but unfortunately failed. When politicians discussed technicalities, manufacturers were ramping up their exports. Curtiss P-40 fighter aircraft appeared on airfields in the UK and France. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat became the first American fighter that served on British aircraft carriers. The Royal Navy called it Mantlet. Then there was the highly versatile Douglas DB-7. It certainly deserves its own mention. As the A-20, this aircraft proved to be so reliable and effective that many Allied powers kept getting them up until the very end of 1944. First, it was shipped to the UK and pre-invasion France, then to the Soviet air forces. Soviet pilots really appreciated their Bostons, as they were very easy to modify, right at the airfield, no less, to fit almost any kind of role. By the end of 1939, American aircraft manufacturers that had massive orders from abroad went one step further. Instead of modifying existing designs to meet the requirements of their European clients, they started working on designs that were meant for export from the very beginning. For instance, the North American P-51 was developed in response to a requirement of the British Purchasing Commission, and Mustang was the name assigned to it by the British. It's also worth noting that many of its modifications were also developed specifically to cater to the needs of the pilots of the RAF. That's why by the spring of 1941, when the Lend-Lease bill was officially signed, the US effectively had a fully functioning system for supplying European nations with American vehicles already in place. Allies in Europe were basically able to get all modern combat vehicles that the US had at their disposal with next to no delay. And soon you could see Hellcats and Avengers serving on British aircraft carriers. The Royal Navy also used Corsairs. They just had their outer wings clipped to clear the deckhead. As a part of the Lend-Lease system, Allies also received and employed aircraft that weren't widely used in the US, like the Vultee Vengeance dive bomber. Most of those aircraft were given to the RAF, pilots of the British Commonwealth, and Free French forces. Then we have the Era Cobra. And it's a bit of an underdog story. American pilots didn't care for it. British and Australian pilots, which were typically somewhat less demanding, weren't happy with it as well. For a little while, no one seemed to know what to do with the aircraft. And then the Lend-Lease policy was extended to the USSR. Imagine the surprise of suppliers when Soviet pilots showered their Aerocobras with praise and eagerly asked for more. The fighter had great speed, excellent maneuverability at low altitudes, and a powerful 37mm gun. In other words, it was a perfect fit for the conditions of the Eastern Front. It's no wonder that this Bell aircraft is still known in Russia as the most Russian-American plane. It also makes perfect sense that the British preferred the powerful Thunderbolts, which were great for fighter escort missions with RAF bombers. Speaking of bombers, by the way, twin-engine North American B-25 medium bombers were used by literally all Allied countries fighting against the threat of Axis powers. And when we say all, we mean it. Even nations with a lot of their own designs. Another good example is the Catalina flying boat, which often served in the capacity of a bomber or a torpedo bomber. This aircraft became truly international. Then we simply have to mention the B-17 and the B-24 strategic bombers. The only air force that received them en masse was the Royal Air Force of the United Kingdom. But a few bombers of this series made it to other countries one way or another, and even saw some action there. Finally, there was also the phenomenon of so-called reverse Lend-Lease, with Allied countries providing equipment and services to the US. What can we say? American pilots loved British Spitfires. 600 of those excellent fighters were used by American forces in the Mediterranean. The US High Command was also very impressed with the capabilities of the Beaufighter Night Fighter, and so it was also promptly accepted into American service. Eventually, British vehicles made it to the USSR as well. All in all, there were thousands and thousands of American planes serving all over the world. Even by the most conservative estimates during the war, at least every third Allied aircraft was built in the US. And then there were also raw materials, all sorts of tools, engines, aircraft components, aircraft equipment. The list goes on and on. Simply put, the importance of that aid is impossible to overestimate.